Welcome back to East Texas Now. The primary runoff is approaching in just a few days on March 26th, and on the Democratic side, there are multiple contests, including for Lieutenant Governor. Joining us is one of the candidates for Texas Lieutenant Governor, one of the Democratic candidates, Marcos Velez. Sir, welcome back to East Texas Now. How you doing?
Doing good. Thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on. Now, before we talk about the runoff, let's talk about the March primary because neither you nor your challenger in this race, Representative Vicki Goodwin, garnered the 50% needed to avoid a runoff. On March 3rd, you garnered about 32% of the vote, while Representative Goodwin garnered about 48%. What are you doing now to appeal to voters who may not have sided with you in March?
Yeah, so we've done a couple things. One, we secured the endorsement of the third candidate in the race. Between me and her, we had the majority of the vote. Two, we're continuing to campaign across the state where working people are, the same way we did in the primary. Our opponent had been campaigning for, well over a year and a half. We got into the race back in December, and so we believe our message of economic populism is working with working class people. We're just making sure we're getting around the state to where people are actually at.
What do you feel that endorsement from Ms. Courtney Head will mean for the campaign?
Look, I think it signals to people that may have been hesitant to support a labor candidate that people across the political spectrum in the Democratic Party have a candidate here. It shows that we have shared values. It shows that we have a shared mission of fighting for everyday normal working class people.
You talk about wanting to spread a message of economic populism. Talk to me about that. What do you mean?
So when you look at the two campaigns, I think the biggest difference is priorities. The priorities for my campaign are things that benefit your pocketbook, heavily focused on raising the state minimum wage. Whether you make minimum wage or not, there's a certain gap that your employer keeps between you and the person that's earning directly beneath you. And so, obviously, understanding that a rising tide lifts all boats, real wages have not kept up with inflation in this state. When you look at healthcare within the state, again, we believe that healthcare access needs to be more affordable. And so that's a big thing for us. And then funding public schools, normal working class people, our kids go to public schools. And so we believe that we need to make sure that not only do we fund those schools, but we pay competitive salaries for teachers and things like that that benefit normal everyday people.
A couple things I want to go off of there, but first, just to be clear, when you talk about economic populism, some may think, socialism. Is that exactly, the same thing?
So look, I think socialism sadly already exists in this state. It exists for corporations. We have all kinds of free money that we give corporate America. We don't do anything for normal middle class working Americans. When I talk about economic populism, I mean an honest day's pay for an honest day's work, and we're not seeing that right now.
Now let's talk about the state minimum wage. You mentioned, wanting to raise it. Is there a specific number you'd like to see it put at?
So it needs to be a living wage. When you look at figures, the last study that we looked at, for you to be able to afford a one-bedroom apartment, pay the basics like insurance, lights, water, gas, state minimum wage needs to be somewhere about $24 an hour.
So would you want to see it put at $24 an hour? $24 an hour.
Unless inflation rises to the point that it needs to be higher, yes, sir, I do believe that's where we should be.
Would the state minimum wage, would you want to see it adjusted for inflation every year?
Yes, sir.
And just to be clear, the state minimum wage right now, I believe, is 7.25, the same as the federal level. What would you say to businesses that wouldn't be able to afford, what would be over 3 times increase in the minimum wage?
I think if we stop subsidizing corporations, we'd have more than enough money to provide subsidies for small businesses so that they could afford to pay those wages. Small businesses are just an extension of normal working class people, but unfortunately, we carried a $24 billion surplus over in the state. How much of that money went back to small businesses and working class people?
How much money do you think the state would get or small businesses would get if you stopped subsidizing corporations?
Well, if we started taxing corporations, at the same rate that we tax normal working class people. I mean, that's billions of dollars over the fiscal period that we're leaving on the table. So I think the biggest thing, though, is keeping the message focused on, hey, look, working class people are struggling right now. And we have a lot of resources available for corporations, not so many resources for that normal everyday person that hits a clock 9 to 5.
What would you say to businesses who may be looking at Texas? Because, we're talking as the state continues to grow. It's one of the largest economies, in the world. If it were, its own country, that's often talked about. What would you say to companies who may be worried that raising, the tax rate would result in them not wanting to come here?
So those same companies operate in other countries, they operate in other states. If they're coming here to take advantage of the situation in this state, then they're taking advantage of working class people. If they're coming here to create jobs and work under the systems that exist here, then they should have no issue paying the same amount of taxes as working class people.
Is there a specific corporate tax rate you're looking at, or it'd have to be different depending on the company?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously it would have to be different. I mean, look, there's certain companies that, based on their size, I mean, just strictly by the number of people they employ, obviously they should receive more support from the state. But these companies that come in and they suck up resources, they use up our water, they use up our electricity in a state where the grid is fragile and water is critical. Should we subsidize those businesses when ranchers, farmers, and normal working class people are struggling to get those same resources?
And you talk about healthcare in one of your previous answers. I want to ask you about rural healthcare in particular. What are some of the challenges, if any, you feel that rural parts of the state are experiencing in terms of healthcare, and what would you do if elected lieutenant governor to solve that?
I think the biggest issue is we're closing hospitals in rural Texas. We have a lack of funding. Obviously, you have a smaller tax base. There's lesser residents, lesser industry out there. So obviously, the state needs to step up and do its fair share at supporting those communities. Obviously, we need to increase funding for rural Texas, make sure that we're funding those hospitals, but also that we're paying healthcare professionals in that part of the state competitively so that they have an incentive to stay rather than migrate to the bigger cities.
How much money you feel it would require to get more hospitals in rural parts of the state, and how you go about funding that?
Yeah, so look, I think one of the easiest ways to increase the amount of revenue we have in this state is through the legalization of cannabis. When you start looking at the amount of money that we leave on the table from a tax base, look, you have states all around the state of Texas that have legalized cannabis and they tax it. It's something that we need to do in this state, and again, we should direct that funding into healthcare and other sort of resources for the community.
So legalizing cannabis, that's what you feel is the solution.
I think it's a solution to a lot of our problems. I mean, corporate taxes and legalizing cannabis.
Well, then let me get your reaction, because I believe there was one Senate bill that was put forward during the last legislative session that would have banned THC altogether in Texas, if my understanding of that bill is correct. Your thoughts on that legislation?
Hey, vehemently opposed. It's archaic legislation and it's not rooted in any science. As a labor activist, I know that we have the ability now to test people for impairment. And so there's no reason that we should have any concern about what people do in the privacy of their own homes when they're not at work.
But you feel that legalizing cannabis would bring a stream of revenue into Texas.
Oh, definitely. Yes, sir.
Now let's talk about the Ten Commandments. After a recent court ruling by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, they can now be displayed in Texas public school classrooms. Your thoughts on the ruling?
I think that we're more concerned with what hangs on the walls of classrooms than whether or not teachers can pay their bills, than whether or not schools are funded, whether they have functioning heat and AC. When I look at all the issues that we have in Texas public schools, our first concern should be whether or not teachers can remain in the profession with the wages we're paying them, whether or not our students can learn, whether our testing standards that we currently have are up to date and if they make any sense. And so, look, what did we really accomplish here? I mean, we laid out a ruling that does nothing to improve the quality of education.
Now, if you do end up winning this runoff, you'll face incumbent Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick in the general election. What can voters expect in terms of a change if you are to win the general election from his tenure to yours?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a complete change in focus. Right now, Dan Patrick is focused on multinational corporations and his donors. I'm focused on the people that are struggling to pay their bills. I'm focused on the people that are worried about their children's futures. I'm focused on the people that are delaying retirement because they're worried about their adult children who are working full-time jobs but can't make ends meet. And so, again, Dan Patrick is focused on the uber rich. I'm focused on the normal, everyday working class person.
If you had to tell voters about one decision you've made throughout your life that you feel defines who you are, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I think it was the decision to become a labor activist and fight for my coworkers, stand up for normal, everyday working class people that are being marginalized by these corporations that come into our state. They steal our resources, they take advantage of our labor, and they don't give anything in return. And so, look, I mean, I think that defines who I am. I believe in the normal, everyday working man. I think government should be for the people, by the people. And I think career politicians are something that were never intended to exist. Government should be run by normal, everyday people who come in, do good work, and move out the way.
If you are to be elected lieutenant governor, is there a set amount of terms you would you set a term limit upon yourself?
Oh yeah, yeah. Look, honestly, today as we speak, one. But I'm not going to rule out. Hey, look, maybe the situation lands where we're having conversations. I don't think anyone should serve more than 2 terms in any position.
So you wouldn't plan to serve more than 2 terms if you are elected.
No, sir.
And you mentioned, if I heard you correctly earlier in this interview, you mentioned water, and water ties into a concern for many in East Texas regarding data centers. What are your thoughts on the development of data centers? Should they be built in Texas?
Look, I think we're in a very delicate place with data centers. One, you have to acknowledge that there are thousands of Texans, skilled professionals that are building these data centers. And so you have electricians, you have plumbers, pipe fitters, you have people that are earning a living because bad trade deals have shipped a lot of our jobs overseas. So we have to address the issue with the job market in this state and make sure people stay gainfully employed. But we also have to accept the fact that there's no regulation right now. These data centers are buying water and electricity. They're ruining ground soil, and they're being built in areas where people don't want them to be built. And so I don't believe that we should have an environment where data centers do whatever they want. If data centers are going to be built, they should be built by skilled, qualified labor. They should be built by people who live in those communities. But again, I mean, we've let the cart go before the horse on this data center thing.
So you'd want to see increased regulation.
Oh, for sure. On data centers, yes, sir.
Any specific regulations you'd want to see put in place for data centers?
I mean, you could easily, just off the top of your head, that we should mandate they have to use closed loop cooling systems. They have to pay whatever market rate is for water and electricity. They should be limited on the amount of water they're allowed to consume. I mean, there's so many different regulations we could roll out. But look, off the top of my head, they shouldn't have any more rights than your average Texan. The biggest one being where they're built, and we shouldn't be popping them down in people's backyards.
I do want to ask you, how do you view the balance between what some see as an economic gain in building data centers and concerns that their development would harm folks in Texas?
I think it goes back to what I said earlier. When you look at the fact that there are a lot of Texans that are making a living building these data centers, we should always be sensitive to the fact that if it's paying someone's bills, and you have working class people that are in that industry, we have to take that into account. But when you talk about long-term gains, look, I don't know that we've really seen the long-term gains. This is a kind of a new industry for all of us, and so we have to proceed with caution.
If you are elected lieutenant governor, what would be your first priority piece of legislation? Because you'd be having to work with other senators. You couldn't introduce a bill yourself, but what would be your biggest priority?
Sure, I work with the Texas Senate to raise the state minimum wage.
Let's talk about the border. How secure is the border now, in your view, and what would you do as lieutenant governor, if anything, about the southern border?
So border security is a federal issue. If you go down to the border, those people feel a lot less secure than they did before. I mean, you have armed agents that really we can kind of question what their training is, jumping out of vans, snatching little old ladies off the street that are American citizens. Obviously, border security is important, and we need to make sure that we take care of arresting criminals. But the reality is we have police departments and sheriff's agencies across the state that are already underfunded that we could spend that money on. I mean, any kind of cooperation with ICE, in my opinion, is a waste of taxpayers' resources. And again, I don't feel like we're any safer today than we were several years ago.
So, do you feel as though ICE should be in Texas at all?
No, they. I mean, look, when you look at ICE, we existed in a time before ICE, and we had law enforcement agencies that took care of security. There's no reason that we need ICE in the state of Texas. Again, if you want to dump all that money into a program, hey, give it to the border towns, sheriff's departments, and police departments, and allow them to handle the crime issues.
What would you say to folks who feel that anyone who is here illegally should be removed from the country and that ICE helps facilitate that?
I think those people don't understand the chaos it creates in the workplace, the chaos it creates within our state. Again, if someone commits a crime, they're going to have to pay for their crime. But the way it's being carried out, you can't tell me that that's orderly, that it's a good use of our resources, or that it's being carried out in a manner that follows due process.
If you do not end up winning the May 26 runoff, do you plan on endorsing in the lieutenant governor contest?
I'll tell you, man, that's a good question. I haven't pondered that one. I'll have to get back to you on that one.
So you don't know right now if you would endorse Representative Vicki Goodwin.
I tell you, that's a great question. I haven't thought about the possibility of losing.
Well, we've covered quite a bit, and the May 26 runoff is coming up in just a few days from now. Is there anything I did not ask you that you would like to add?
No, I think the only thing that I'd like to say is, hey, look, when people go out there and they make their decision, the Democratic primary, I believe I have more in common with everyday working people than any other candidate on the ballot. If you go to work for a living, if you pay bills, if you're worried about, rising costs within this state, I think we're on the same, we're in the same boat. And so, I'd humbly ask for your support in this runoff and look forward to representing the working people of Texas.
Democratic candidate for Texas Lieutenant Governor Marcos Velez. Sir, we appreciate you coming on East Texas Now today.